This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello, Marcel Proust's novel À la recherche du temps perdu, or In Search of Lost Time, has been called the definitive modern novel. His stylistic innovation, sensory exploration and fascination with memory were to influence a whole body of thinkers from the German intellectuals of the 1930s to the Bloomsbury set, chief among them Virginia Woolf, and innumerable critics and novelists since. But how did he succeed in creating a 3,000-page novel with such an artistic coherence? To what extent did John Ruskin influence Proust? Is his fascination with memory and recall simply a nostalgia for the past? And what impact did he have on the 20th century novel? With me to discuss Proust are Jacqueline Rose, Professor of English Literature at Queen Mary University, London, and author of Albertine, a novel based on a rewriting of Proust's central female character; Malcolm Bowie, Master of Christ's College, Cambridge, and author of Proust Among the Stars; and Dr. Robert Fraser, Senior Research Fellow in the Literature Department at the Open University and author of Proust and the Victorians. Jacqueline Rose, why can In Search of Lost Time be seen as the definitive modern novel?
Well, I think it's because Proust did something quite extraordinary, which is that he put us inside somebody's mind in a way and with a kind of determination and an elasticity, a capacity to move inside that mind in a way that nobody had ever done before. I mean, he has been described as a cross between Dickens and James because he has this ability to conjure up a social world and then plunge you into the mind recording it, and the mind beyond just the recording of that world, which is quite unique. And he makes the mind tactile. It is a very sensuous novel. So it's not just the interiority of thought, it's also a physical sensation of being inside that mind. It's a kind of erotics of thought, and nobody had done that before.
Well, there are three things there. Why, to be more specific, do you think it could be called definitive? Why do you think it could be called modern? And how is he actually describing the process of thinking?
Well, I'll take modern first because, it is rather remarkable that Freud and Proust never read a single word of each other. But in fact, the analogies between them are incredibly powerful.
We're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, a novel written between 1912 and 1922.
So Freud and Proust are writing at the same time. And for some reason, which is difficult to give a simple answer to, both Freud and Proust thought that the best way to get inside the mind was to go behind what the mind thinks it knows of itself. That is to say, to allow for the fact that there are pockets of thought and areas of feeling which our conscious, controlling minds do not have access to, and that the mind is the friend to all kinds of things which, if we stop in the tracks of our normal identities, we wouldn't be comfortable with. And the reason why I think Proust is the definitive modern novel is because he gives flesh to that in a way that Freud can't. I mean, Freud is trying to be scientific, he's trying to control it, whereas Proust, although he has a very strong understand this agenda, plunges you inside the processes. And you have to lose yourself there. You cannot read Proust unless you're willing to really let go and go inside there with him.
What about this business of describing thinking, writing? Everybody will know about the long sentences, the extremely long sentences are sometimes used, and you've said somewhere that this actually, you think, describes the way in which we do think. Or reflects the way in which we do.
It has a kind of similarity to the method that Freud devised for the psychoanalytic session, which is a kind of free association, which is the mind is allowed to wander inside its own processes, although it's much more controlled in Proust. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But the Proustian sentence is a phenomenon which one approaches with trepidation and comes out feeling one's just had an amazing sort of massage or swim or something. I mean, many readers of Proust, I always say to my students, the first time you read a Proust sentence, if you hold on too tight, you'll lose it. You will not be able to get to the end of the sentence. It's like jumping into the pool. You have to go in there and let it carry you. And if you don't, you will drown. And I think this is an amazing sort of rendition of the way we both control our own minds and have to let ourselves go inside them.
How radical was it perceived at the time of its publication?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to or who you're referring to. I mean, some people thought it was just outrageous. There's the famous publisher who, when he received the first section, said, "You don't really expect me to publish something which is a man tossing and turning and trying to go to sleep for 30 pages. I mean, this is just ridiculous." And I think it was Anatole France who famously said, Proust is too long, life is too short. I mean, a lot of people didn't like it and didn't get it. James Joyce didn't get it. He said, "I don't see a special talent, but then I'm not very, famously, I'm no good as a literary critic." So a lot of people didn't get it. And then people were outraged by it, not just because of what it forced you to do as a reader, but because of some of the very specific areas of sexuality that it touches on, and what could be described, I think, fairly as the perversity of it. And it enraged some people.
Can you be more specific about that?
Well, the treatment of homosexuality was seen as scandalous in some ways, although we have to remember that, in fact, sodomy had been decriminalised in France from 1790 onwards. And then that was ratified in 1810. But nonetheless, people did find that very shocking. It is shocking to read now. It's shocking to read now.
Malcolm Bauer, in the early 20th century, Paris was a major centre of European modernism. How far was Proust part of that?
On the surface, he was a real part of it, a very energetic attender at art shows and theatrical events, musical events even sometimes. There's a wonderful moment in 1922, 6 months before Proust's death, when he comes out into society, and specifically to a party hosted by Diaghilev, of all people. And at the party are Stravinsky, Picasso, James Joyce, Marcel Proust, and they're all talking to each other. We have Joyce's impressions of this occasion. We have Stravinsky's impressions of this occasion. So if you look at the story simply in terms of the social highlights of the Proust career, he was very well connected indeed. Which of us could put a guest list like that together now? On the other hand, if you look at what's actually going on in the novel, it seems to me that those cultural reference points, fellow European modernists, are very much less important than, shall we say, Ruskin, we'll be talking about in a little while. And the preponderant influences that are there visibly rippling through the texture of Proust's writing are from the French tradition. Racine and Balzac and Hugo are more or less ubiquitous in the elusive fabric of this work. So he thinks of himself as a great writer, and his experiments are largely on native-born French literary materials rather than strange things brought in the way that South Sea Island tribal masks were brought to Parisian exhibitions to have a huge influence on Picasso and so forth. There's none of that sense of modernism being to do with incongruity and exoticism. Modernism in Proust's hands is very much a homegrown product, but that product being reprocessed in such a way as to turn it towards its own critical mass or its own explosive power.
You've described by your allusions the Frenchness of Proust and by implication the society man that Proust was, but there was an outsider element in Proust. Was that to a certain extent driven by his Jewishness, to a certain extent driven by his homosexual, although, as Jacqueline Rose pointed out, that was not a crime in France after the 1790s?
What's strange about the Jewishness of Proust and the homosexuality of Proust is that they are both disguised in À la Recherche itself. They weren't, certainly the Jewishness was not disguised in his earlier writings. So the narrator figure turns out not to be Jewish, although to have many Jewish friends, and he turns out spectacularly, as Tom Gunn in a rather angry little squib noted, the narrator turns out not to be homosexual at all. Everyone else is in danger of being brought out of the closet, except the narrator. Now, why is he doing this? The narrator, far from simply keeping Jewishness and homosexuality at arm's length and removing all trace of those things from himself, in fact opens up this inner world that we were talking about a moment ago in such a way that there's a tremendous play of fantasy and identification with homosexual and Jewish characters as the thing goes on. So the subjectivity of the narrator is an arena in which a whole range of different forms of engagement, insiderness and outsiderness, can be rehearsed and manipulated and transformed.
It gathered for a while, Robert Fraser, it gathered the reputation of being a passport to high culture. If you read and knew your Proust, you were a highly cultured person. Would you say that's a fair comment?
Well, I think certainly now that would be its reputation, and I think that probably would be its reputation immediately after the first couple of volumes came out. But if you go right back to the beginning of Proust's career, there wasn't much sense that this man would produce the great book. In fact, up till about 1913, his social reputation was very much as a kind of gadfly, so much so that in 1913, he attempted to publish the first volume, De Côté des Chez Swann, Swann's Way, and submitted it to La Nouvelle Revue Française. André Gide, who was the reader on the Readers' Committee, turned it down on the basis, I think, that nobody with the kind of reputation that Proust had in 1913 could possibly produce a serious work of literature. But what had been going on, I think, is a long process of gestation, a long process of preparation, going right the way back to about 1895, when Proust first thought of writing a novel. He produced an autobiographical novel in the third person called Jean Santeuil, which covers a lot of the same ground as À la recherche du temps perdu, but in a very different way, in a very less imaginative, a very much less challenging way. And then in 1899, something very strange happened. He fell in love with the work of John Ruskin almost overnight. After reading an extract from one of Ruskin's works in a Belgian magazine, he then devoted the next 6 years to a systematic study of Ruskin. Although his English was rather poor, he always said that he learned English by reading Ruskin, so as you can imagine, his English was slightly quaint.
I mean, I'm sure it'll interest as many people as it interests me that a novelist so, as it seems, French, and so, as Malcolm has said, steeped in Frenchness, and as Jacques implied, so, as it were, over there, should batten onto Ruskin, about whom I suspect people have a rather hazy view nowadays, although he was massively important as an art critic in the 19th century in this country, and a friend and ultimately a destroyer of Turner in certain ways, but that's another programme. And he wrote in this very high-minded, rigorously moralistic way about art. It would not seem on the surface that someone from Proust's background, which you've sketched in, but very wealthy, he was a snob, he liked society, he seemed to be playing around with literature and got that reputation, as you said, as sort of playing a tennis racket as a banjo, a bit of a gadfly, that he would go for Ruskin. So can you just give us more details as to what really attracted him about the work of John Ruskin?
I think that he found a number of things in Ruskin. The first one was a highly intelligent aesthetic. A way of interpreting the world aesthetically, sensuously, but also intellectually, and along historical dimension. Ruskin enabled him, as it were, to historically situate his artistic, his aesthetic intuitions. And these intuitions fastened upon certain artworks, certain buildings that Ruskin extolled. There are certain artists which Ruskin introduced Proust to, Carpaccio, Giotto, which became very, very important in the structure eventually of À la recherche du temps perdu. Certain buildings as well, the great cathedrals of France that Ruskin wrote about in his book and books, and which Proust used to conduct pilgrimages to. So in many ways, I think that Ruskin radically altered Proust's view of history and gave him a much longer view of history, enabling him to situate his, as it were, his sensuous intimations of the everyday in this long historical dimension.
Malcolm, when it was finished, The Search of Lost Time was a novel of 3,000 pages. How would you explain how that held together?
I would say simply that it has one of the world's great plots. You remember Coleridge at a certain moment asked himself to reel off the greatest plots known to him at the time, in the early 19th century, and he came up with Oedipus Rex and Tom Jones and The Alchemist and one or two others. Now, if he'd had the good fortune to read À la recherche du temps perdu, I think he would have included that plot among them. It's a most extraordinary thing, and I don't know whether on air one should be giving away the ending of the thing. There is an element of well-madeness in purely whodunit terms. The novel has a denouement that has been set up from thousands of pages earlier with hints and glimpses of possible outcomes, multiple plot strands, and the whole thing comes round to a really extraordinary conclusion in the end, with hugely many, not all, but hugely many of the loose ends tied up. Now, that plottedness over 3,000 pages is one of the miracles of the book, and unfortunately is one of the miracles that's only accessible to people who have plunged on beyond the first volume, which is the point at which many Proust readers, unfortunately, at the moment seem to give up, and taken themselves through the central volumes towards that extraordinary final tableau in Le Temps Retrouvé.
Well, I'm rather surprised at that, because I would have thought that the first answer to What Holds It Together would not have been plot, but it's very refreshing in a way to say it's plot. It's the plot that does it. E.M. Forster's, 2 cheers for the plot, or whatever he said, 2 cheers. What do you think, Jacqueline? Do you think it's the plot that drives these 3,000 pages through?
Well, only retrospectively, which means it can't be what makes you read it. So I think what drives you through it is the hints that there will have been one. That's to say, I absolutely agree with Malcolm.
It's 2 cheers for democracy. Yes, and alas, a novel has to have a plot. It was going to bother me if I didn't get it out, so there you go.
Well, it's sort of... It tantalizes you. It gives you the feeling, as Malcolm says, that something is going to be resolved. And that, lures you on and means you somehow can't put it down. But the other thing I think that makes it hold together is the fact that it forces you to live what it's about, which is about memory. So insofar as the novel is about how far we can retrieve our past selves and how far those are determinant in precipitating us towards and deciding what our future is going to be like, it issues a challenge to the reader to see how much of it you can retain in your mind as you go. And that applies to the sentence, because they're so long. It applies to the paragraph. I have a friend who says he calls out to his partner, "I'll come and do the dishes when I finish this Proust sentence." Little does she know that means half an hour later, right? So it works at every level. And as you're going through it, you are retaining certain things and you're losing them. And then you will be reminded again. So you're constantly having this kind of aha experience, which is, of course, I'd forgotten that. There it is again. And there's something incredibly satisfying about those moments of loss and then regaining something, which is, of course, what the book is about. So I think that's what makes you go through and carry on.
Robert Fraser, the book talks about memory, talks about regaining time, and what most people will know about Proust is the what happens after the Madeleine is dipped in the concoction of lime that he used to drink as a boy. Can you discuss memory in terms of the construction of the book?
Yes, well, right from the beginning in his criticism, Proust drew a distinction between what he called voluntary memory and what he called involuntary memory. Voluntary memory we exercise all the time, every time we remember to go to the shops, every time we remember our next-door neighbour's name or fail to. Involuntary memory is something that steals up upon us. It's much more like a déjà vu. It's drinking a certain drink. The sensation of the drink on our tongue reminds us of a previous occasion when we might have had that particular cluster of sensations. Proust's view, actually, was that the involuntary memory, which you might call the unconscious memory, though it's not a term that I like very much, is in some way much more patterned, much more orderly, much more coherent than the conscious memory is, than the deliberate memory is. Now, this is the opposite of what most people think. Most people don't trust their unconscious minds. They trust their conscious minds because they need their conscious minds to get them through the day. But Proust, I think, had an immense faith in the involuntary memory and what it conjured forth. Just before he published Swann's Way, the first volume of his great sequence, he published in a magazine called Le Temps in Paris an interesting article which actually is an interview with himself. The interviewer is not named, but the interviewer is quite clearly Proust, and the interviewee is Proust as well. And they talk about the memory. And the interviewer says, now, what is this about the involuntary memory? What's so important about it? And the interviewee, who's also Proust the novelist, says, well, when you remember something in this involuntary way, it comes clothed in association. The word is vetu, in association. It brings an entire world with it. And therefore, in a way, the unconscious memory, random as it may seem, accidental as it may seem, is far more coherent and artistically wholesome than the conscious memory.
Do you agree with that, and do you think, more importantly, that Proust worked on that principle, Malcolm?
Look, I'm going to be heretical for a moment, if I may. I don't think this book is as much about memory as we've been suggesting and as criticism of the novel and publicity blurbs about the novel suggest. Memory is there, sure enough. It's got a couple of spotlights within the plot that I was mentioning a moment ago, trained upon it. In the middle of the first volume of the novel, there's the experience that Melvyn was talking about with the Madeleine cake dipped in tea and a whole seemingly lost past becoming available again. And I'm not giving very much away about the end of the novel if I tell you that a larger, more sumptuously orchestrated version of that same incident is there towards the end of the book. But memory of that kind, that's to say, involuntarily having access to past materials that one thought had disappeared forever, does not propel the central volumes of the novel, it seems to me. There one has to think in terms of the narrator's curiosity about the behavior of Albertine, the female co-protagonist of the book. Now, his curiosity about her, which sustains the narrative and the sentences that we've been talking about for dozens of pages, hundreds of pages on end, that's a curiosity about the here and now. What's she doing? What's she doing at the moment? What was she doing yesterday? Where's she going to go tomorrow? Is she going where she tells me she's going to go, or is she going to do something completely different? Now, that is a portrait of desire-driven, future-driven, speculative thought brought to bear on, in this case, other people's sexual conduct and sexual preferences. Now, if you come at those central volumes of the novel, and then we must include the central volumes which are full of social observation of the here and now of the narrator's Parisian experience, armed simply with a battery of memory concepts, you don't get very far in understanding what's going on.
Can we actually transfer this to, which I think is a good, terrific starting point, transferring this to to Swan in Love, where Swan is seduced by and then falls in love with someone variously described in blurbs as a courtesan, a cocotte, and a prostitute. Odette, you can tell me which she is, you think, Jacqueline. That becomes all three. That becomes obsessive, humiliating, an extraordinarily involved, driven passion, Swan, for this unlikely as it starts a person. And I don't. Malcolm's made us all not give anything away. So okay, why she's unlikely, and so how she becomes likely. But she possesses him in a way which is quite almost pathological at a certain stage. And I agree that you could go along with Malcolm. That's got everything to do with the present of Swan's immediate life, hasn't it?
Yes and no, you see. I mean, I agree and disagree with what Malcolm said. I mean, I think the two things are intimately and passionately related, because the desire to know the other and the recognition but on the part of the male narrator that he cannot know and control the woman seems to me another version of not being able to know and control one's memories. I say the central issue here is how far one can take possession of something and indeed of oneself. And one of my favourite moments in Proust is when he says, "Our lives are full of memories, but we do not have the ability to recall them." Given that that's the case, why do we think those memories we can't recall just go back to the last 30 years of our lives? Maybe they go back to another planet and lives we lived in the bodies of other men. Let's say this is really infinity we're talking about here. Now, I think what happens is the concern about memory and what we can and we can't know about our own minds then fixes on the body and the mind and the existence of these women variously throughout the novel. And it becomes, as it were, an allegory for a chase after something which in his wisest moments, Proust knows one can never control or know, because you never know what the people you love are doing when they're not with you. I mean, that's the basic problem here. So you can never know and control another person. With Odette de Crécy, it becomes eroticized as what was she up to yesterday and how far can I have actually been there where she was if I read the letter that I think possibly her lover sent her, only to find out that in fact it wasn't her lover, but by reading it, where am I putting myself? So there's a kind of box within box within box structure of the perversity of the desire to control her. And she is given this wondrous sensuous presence and this incredible, well, slightly cruel casualness about the whole thing, which is how she brings him in and how she sustains him and sustains his passion for her. And, of course, as you said, and we can give this away because it's the end of the first volume, he says, how could I have spent so long completely preoccupied by a woman who wasn't even to my taste?
Wasn't my type.
Wasn't my type, yes.
You feel absolutely nothing is left to chance in these 3,000 pages at all. And it does begin, as Jacqueline has reminded us, with pages of someone not being able to get to sleep, if you want to put it that way, and then a man and then a boy not being able to get to sleep. And the idea of the piece, the whole piece existing in that twilight zone, let's leave it as twilight, even though it's that's the right time of day, come to think of it, isn't it? In that twilight zone between consciousness and unconsciousness, and that seems to me to be what he's saying. Look, this is where I'm placing the novel, and that seems to me, perhaps for me anyway, one of the most striking differences of all about it is that I'm going from there to there. I'm moving around in this strange area that we all know about. When we can't sleep, when we're half awake, we don't quite know whether awake or asleep. Is it a dream, or am I in the dream? Am I the dream? And so on and so forth. Everybody knows about that. And it seems to me that is the centre of it from my reading. What do you think, Jack?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, it's a borderline novel. I mean, there's a term in psychoanalysis now which is borderline, which means neither neurotic or psychotic, because the psychotic really remolds the world in their own phantasmatic images, whereas the neurotic just represses everything and gets very unhappy. And Proust really is operating on that borderline, because there is just the immersion in the misery of the soul, and then there are these dramatic attempts to control and transform the world in his own phantasmagoria. And I think where I would sort of agree and disagree with Malcolm is that I know the moments he's talking about are the magical transformation of the world, and I think in some sense they are the redemptive moments of the book. But I have to call them up when I'm faced with a sceptical student who says, they cannot stand this novel because this guy is so self-obsessed and nobody else exists for him except as a projection of his own imagination. You really have to tough it out with students over this and say, well, doesn't the fact that he's thinking about it and is willing, exactly as you say, Melvyn, to lose the mind in its least certain places, doesn't that allow a kind of ethical questioning of that form of self-obsession? But it's a difficult argument you have to have.
Isn't an aspect of this control, please come in a second, isn't an aspect of this wanting to control everything, that even the person that, say, Swann, to stick to Swann, because it's easy for people to hold on to, he's completely obsessed with Odette, and the only way he can really control her is by imagining her, putting her into a painting, and saying, oh, she reminds me of that figure in that painting by Botticelli, although he dismisses Botticelli as the second-rate name of the anyway, he's in that painting by Botticelli. Now I've got a fix on her. Now I know who she is and what she is. Is that part of that?
Oh, absolutely. But he's saying something so strange about desire, that you don't desire directly. You desire through association. Somebody reminds you of somebody, or somebody makes you think of somebody else, or even, to refer back to the discussion of Ruskin, you only desire something if it's already been aesthetically framed for you. And that comes very close to moments to saying there are no people in the world, and certainly at moments there are no women in the world. They're simply these people rendered to you by their aesthetic transformation through culture.
No.
There are no people in the world, but good heavens, he's a comic novelist. He's out there in society. He has a wonderful parade of buffoons and charlatans and mountebanks who are introduced in the first volume, remain in the texture of the plot for 3,000 pages, become ever more absurdly themselves, ever more over the top in their self-presentation in society. And the relish and the detail and the ingenuity and the malice with which those comic characters are represented, and the insistence and the coming back to them endlessly, is a feature of the imagination at work. So when we talk about twilight worlds and desire worlds, we've got to remember that this is a book that is hugely funny, hugely well observed, and contains a whole litter of human foible and of moral comment on human foible, page after page. Now that is not a portrait of the mind in action, or paranoid fantasy structures in action, although it may abut upon those things. It's essentially a portrait of social man and woman doing absurd things in salon society.
Robert?
Yes, I would like to take issue really with the adverb only in Jacqueline's answer. I think we might say that Proust circumscribes desire by saying that people only entertain desire when it's aesthetically framed. But the aesthetic frame is terribly important for Proust. He was very interested in desire, very interested in structure. Of course, we're post-structuralists. We like to dismantle all these things. But the historical, the cultural frame is desperately important in Proust, which is why Ruskin was so important to him. There's one moment I would like to just describe for a moment when the narrator, who's fallen out of love with Gilberte, transfers his affections temporarily to Gilberte's mother, who's Odette de Crécy, who's now Madame Swann. And it's Maytime in the Bois de Boulogne. And they go for this long walk along the Avenue des Bois. And Odette is there, and she's acknowledging all the gentlemen who are doffing their caps to her. And at one moment, it's a balmy spring day, she hands her coat to the narrator, who puts it over his arm. As he does so, he notices the stitching inside the coat that he hadn't seen before. Whereupon Proust goes into a long epic simile, he says, as a man who reaches a cathedral town, finds a great cathedral in front of him. This is obviously Amiens Cathedral. He climbs up to the balustrade on the west front, and he looks at the back of the balustrade, and he notices a detail that he never saw before. And suddenly this fashion note about Odette de Crécy is given this huge cultural resonance by means of a reference, not an acknowledged reference, but a reference to Ruskin's work and to medieval art and cathedrals. That kind of aesthetic framing, I think, is very, very, and historical framing, is very important for Proust.
We've hinted at, and Malcolm has rather fiercely brought us back to the certain social realities of Proust, which are undeniable and to be celebrated. What sort of society do you think, Jacqueline Rose, what sort of society can you discuss that he moved in and described? What was the Paris society?
Well,
the book comes out as a book full of snobbish persons,
well,
very
indeed.
funny, very witty, very savage, and savage in many cases, as Malcolm has said. But we're talking about levels of society, people who pose like a Vergerins, a bit like the Veneerings in Dickens, aren't they, and are dismissed, and the high society, the princesses and all these people who...
Well, I agree with Malcolm that there's that whole strand to the novel, and I certainly agree with what was just said about the way you can go from a personal obsession into a larger aesthetic and historical preoccupation. I think that's crucial. The problem with the social world that he describes is that, I mean, he's a snob who provides the most brilliant critique of snobbery we've ever had, and there's a real ambiguity at the heart of his belonging in that world. I mean, he came from an upper-middle-class professional medical family, and all he wanted to do was hang out with aristocrats and royalty. And, fine, he allowed them to indict themselves in the most chilling and devastating way. I mean, they just tear themselves to shreds under his acute eye. But you can't help thinking, why are you here? What the hell are you doing here? And I know I'm
and
not...
he can't stop telling us how superior he is to the people slightly lower down the social scale. They don't realise what one hell of a chap he's just come from this really big party in the film, for example. And actually, you've got to laugh at him, even though he's, 40 times more clever than you at laughing at everything.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only person who's got stuck in the odd dinner party thinking, it's 200 more pages to go in this dinner party. If he doesn't leave now, I'm leaving. I mean, you have to say, what is he doing there? But if we could just go back a second to the discussion about the part of him that is not just self-obsessed, I think it's important that even if you're talking about desire, to recognise the moments in the novel where something takes flight, which goes beyond this obsessive psychological desiring intelligence. And they are very often the relationships between the women, like between the mother and the grandmother, and the forms of considerateness and sensitivity to somebody being someone else in the world, which he never captures through his own desire, and he interestingly never captures through a male subjectivity. It's nearly always the women who do that, so much so that a recent critic, Elizabeth Leidenson, has written a book called Proust's Lesbianism, in which she argues that the only really genuine erotics of connection to another come through the relationships with women, as if he's laying down his arms there and saying, I don't know, I don't understand, but they're getting up to something very different from what I've just spent 500 pages describing.
Also, the grandmother you mentioned, at a certain moment in the course of the novel, during the seaside holidays in Baalbek that the family take every year, moves the narrator and moves him even more in retrospect, moves him to tears simply by tapping on the wall of her hotel room and making contact, non-verbally, not even pre-verbally, just by knocking, with a needy and rather bereft young person. So there's a tremendous respect and craving in the novel for non-verbal forms of communication. It's built into, embroidered into this huge verbal fresco, and this emphatic, over-the-top, showy, ostentatious verbal performance has got its own otherness, its own alternative dimension caught up in it very beautifully.
Can we just talk for a few minutes now about the legacy of Proust? People will know that the Bloomsbury Group, first of all, they printed him, and as it were, they translated him first in this country, and Virginia Woolf was very influenced by him and didn't want to be too influenced by him because she didn't want to be bowled over by him. But let's take that, as it were, said, and move on from there, the rest of the century and into this century. What sort of general influence do you think Proust has had? Let's confine it to this country, on criticism, on writing, on thought about fiction in this country. Malcolm, to start with.
Proust, it seems to me, provides an extension of that extraordinary D.H. Lawrence essay, Why the Novel Matters. The novel matters, Lawrence says, because it's the bright book of life. It's real man and real woman, man alive, and so on and so forth. That's right. And everything that can happen at any level, in any dimension at all, that's human, can go into the novel. And it seems to me that Proust extends that vastly by saying, in a way that Lawrence never would, let's imagine that the person whose hand goes sensuously out towards his pen and begins to write is also a thinking being, a theorist, somebody who cogitates and expatiates inwardly on his own experience. And what Proust has done is expand the novel in ways that we've been talking about to include inwardness as well as moral and social behavior and a parade of characters. Vitally interreacting within the plot. So this is the novel in an extraordinary form of ambition and aspiration towards a new inclusiveness. And I think it's that element that has given other novelists in Britain and elsewhere an extraordinary sense of the novel still being that which preeminently matters among the literary genre.
Jacqueline.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, the death of the novel is called, every other year, as you know, and it goes on being written. And I think what Proust does is give the combination of the social reality and the inward thought, but also a kind of pushing both of those to an extreme, which actually I think the legacy is ambiguous because I don't think many people have done it since, quite honestly. I think the perversity, which we haven't touched on that much, and I mean perversity in an open-minded sense, but the kind of complications of sexuality, which make contemporary queer theory look positively innocent by comparison, and the hallucinogenic quality of the sensuous imagination, I think you'd be hard-pushed to find writers today who've managed to do that in that particular combination. On the other hand, he has had the most extraordinary influence, and you're right to keep alluding to the Bloomsbury Group, but that was a specific moment where it felt as if it was acceptable for somebody like Woolf and Joyce and Dorothy Richardson to really internalise thought to the point where language almost couldn't sustain it. And I think that level of experimentation has not become the predominant form in the novel since then.
Robert Fresno.
As well as having a huge effect on the novel, both in France and England, he's also had a huge effect on the language of criticism. In the 1960s, the structuralist critics such as Gérard Genette took Proust as the template of writing about narrative. So much so that since the 1960s, you almost can't discuss narrative of any shape or form without implicitly discussing Proust, whether you think you are or not. I mean, I've written books about the fiction 2,000 miles away from Proust, yet I always have Proust at the back of my mind. You just can't get away from him. He's always there.
Do you find, three of you, finally, that obviously you're very, very knowledgeable, and do you think that he is a novelist whose readership is increasing? he would seem on the surface to be the anti-novel of our times, on the surface. Nowadays, with the usual litany, people say television, radio, film, so on and so forth. Who can sit down? Who has the time? Who has the silence? Who has the privacy? Who has the temperament to face 3,000 pages of a novel? Surely that time, that mind has passed. Would you deny that, Malcolm?
I think he's become a commodity, and the length is something to do with that. In order to demonstrate one's civilization and one's exquisiteness of taste and so forth, one needs to be seen around with at least some of those volumes under one's arm or on one's coffee table, the rest of it. But there are, and of course there are numerous adaptations and extensions, of course, that give him a sort of second-order currency within the culture. But there are, I find, increasingly many people who really do read him all the way through, many times over, and have serious things to say about him. I think he's become ever more intimately ingrained into the consciousness of the Western reading public, if I can put it in those terms.
And I think he's having a rebirth at the moment, not just the new translation, but also Raoul Reese's extraordinary film of Time Regained, Chantal Akerman's film of The Captive. And I think there's a real question about why on the turn of the new millennium he's become a new cult object. And I think it's because the century is beginning to think, how are we going to remember ourselves? And I think that's given him a very new pertinence as we leave one millennium into the next. The question is, how are we constituting our own historical and personal memories? And it's brought him back, and I think that will continue.
Robert Frame?
I also think that Proust is full of things that we can rediscover. We can rediscover, for example, the music of the long sentence. People tend to write in short sentences now, but I think the tide will turn. The music of the long sentence, the music of the long paragraph, the music of the long volume, the roman fleuve, all of these things are things with immense potential which we can learn from and continue learning from.
Well, thank you all very much indeed, and thank you very much for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.